Hello, I'm in the Church of St Julian in Norwich. It's not the biggest church in Norwich, but it's almost certainly the oldest, older even than the cathedral. This church has withstood so many challenges over so many centuries, and today it's world famous for its connection with Julian of Norwich. Firstly, let me talk a bit about the church itself, because this building in a way echoes the entire history of Norwich. Almost certainly here before the Norman invasion, this church survived plague during the 14th century. By the 16th century, it survives being stripped by Henry VIII. In the 17th century, plague returns again. Every time the church is restored, refreshed, rebuilt, maintained, and carries on central to the community of Norwich. As late as 1906, there's some excavation work done, which I'll talk to you more about later, because that links the two parts of our story. In 1942, the church was bombed. The damage was extensive, and yet by 1952, once again, the Church of St Julian has been restored, refreshed, and now it will have an anchorite's cell attached to it, and that's an important part of our story. Interwoven into the long history of this church building is the story of one particular woman, a woman of world renown, and yet a woman of whom we know so very little. Let me take you back to Norwich in 1342. It's a bustling, thriving city, second only to London, a commercial hub. It's already been affected by plague, and now a young girl is born. We don't know her name, but she survives another outbreak of the plague, and then, in her 30s, she succumbs to a life-threatening illness. And it's when she's being read the last rites that she experiences something that will not only change her life, but will go on to touch the lives of countless thousands of people through history and up to today. As that young woman lay on what she perceived to be her deathbed, she stared at the priest's crucifix. And in that moment, to her, Jesus came alive and spoke to her. She would survive the illness and go on to do something truly radical. Recovered, the young woman will come here to this church. She will spend the rest of her life in a cell, living here, attached to the church, and she will take her name from this church. From here on, she will be known as Julian of Norwich. Now, I mentioned earlier that there had been some excavations in 1906, and the reason they are important is that it was believed they'd uncovered the foundations of the room in which Julian had lived. It would have been a room of roughly these proportions, and she would have given advice and counsel to the community through a window such as this, as part of her role of what was known as an anchorite. As an anchorite, Julian would have lived in a room of roughly these proportions, and this room or cell is today an integral part of the Church of St Julian in her memory. At the same time as offering advice and counsel through her window, Julian was doing something else. She'd become determined to communicate what she had seen in the revelations as she lay so ill on what she still believed at that time was her deathbed. She now wrote a book called The Divine Revelations, and it has touched thousands of people in Christian thought. The really profound point about this book is that, written in the 14th century, it is the first book by a known woman author in the English language. As important as they are, it's interesting to note that Julian's writings were in fact largely forgotten for hundreds of years, and it's not until the early 20th century that a new edition of her work with an intelligent and sympathetic introduction is issued. At that point, interest in her thinking is reignited, and she is now studied worldwide. She's recognised as a seriously important thinker in Christian theology. What is fascinating is to ponder for a moment on the fact that this book, written in the Middle Ages at a time of plague, still has such a resonance in today's world, and that her most famous and most quoted line is, "All shall be well."